Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. We're so delighted to have Nicolette back to do another session for us. And thanks everyone for joining. Just a couple of things that I want to mention right at the start. First of all, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the Washington State Historical Society is located on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We pay respect to their elders past and present. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where you all are joining us from today. Please take a minute, if you don't mind, to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know what organization you're from. And if you'd like to include a land acknowledgement of your own in that chat, that would be wonderful. Y'all know the drill, right? Please stay on mute throughout the session unless you're speaking. Any questions that pop up, go ahead and type questions or ideas, anything that pops up, go ahead and type that into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on the chat and kind of share those questions with Nicolette towards the end when we have sort of time for Q&A. We are at one point at the end of the session going to head into breakout rooms for a little bit of small group discussion. If you haven't done that before, don't worry, it's very straightforward and you'll kind of be prompted by Zoom to do what you should do. So you don't need to worry about that at all. Again, we're here to sort of talk about collections and the kinds of decisions that all museums and collecting organizations make about what to accept and what not to accept into their collection, and sort of how do you make those decisions. And we're so happy to have Nicolette here. I just want to tell you a little bit about her. She has worked with photograph collections for, well, more than 25 years. I think last time I said 25, and I think you mentioned closer to maybe 35 years.
Closer to 40.
40, awesome. Well, I'll make that edit. So 40 years of experience working with photograph collections. She is currently the visual materials curator for the University of Washington Library's Special Collections. Prior to that, she was the visual materials curator at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And before that, the photo archivist for the Kansas collection at the University of Kansas. She has taught courses on management of photograph collections and on understanding photographs as historic documents. And she's the author of 4 books: Wisconsin Revisited, Then and Now, the Wisconsin Sesquicentennial Rephotography Project, Picturing the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, The Photographs of Frank H. Noel, and Shadows of a Fleeting World, Pictorial Photography, and the Seattle Camera Club. So join me in welcoming Nicolette, and I'll let her take it from here.
Thank you, Allison. I first have to say, just to warn you, I have a very elderly dog who tends to get up and start barking at nothing. So I just want to warn you in the middle of my talk. I'm hoping he's sleeping now. I'm hoping that he remains sleeping, but I just want to warn you, you may hear some barking in the midst of this. If I'm lucky, he'll sleep through it. So yes, let's get to my PowerPoint. Let's see, slideshow. There we go. So the name of my talk is Never Accept a Gift That Eats. And some gifts do eat, and they take more than they give. So first, to understand about collections management, it's not just how you preserve your photos for years to come, which is obviously extremely important, but it's also about making decisions that positively impact your institution's ability to offer useful, quality, and accessible collections to patrons.
Nicolette, quickly, have you already shared your PowerPoint?
Oh, shoot. Excuse me.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. We just can't see anything.
No. Let me start again. I'm sorry. You know, this is Zoom. Hold it. I lost myself. I was so into getting into the PowerPoint that I forgot to share the screen. Let's get there. Okay. Now I think I've got it. So excuse me, I'm sorry about that.
No problem. There we go. Now we can see it.
Okay, but I need to get to there we go. Okay,
Yep.
Do you all see it? Okay, so I'll start again. So collection management is not about how to preserve, not just about how to preserve your photos for years to come, but it's also about making decisions that positively impact your institution's ability to offer useful, quality, and accessible collections to patrons. So when we're looking at collecting, there are what I would say 4 methods of collecting. Obviously, the biggest one is donation, but there's also copying, which is a form of purchase because you're paying to copy. It still costs you something, money, time, whatever. Purchase, and what I call proactive collecting. So I want to tell you just briefly, and this may not be something that you ever do, but I've been very successful in doing this. And what I mean by proactive collecting is that because I also, as a photographer myself, and always was connected to the photography communities, what I would do when I wanted to collect something that I may not get into my collection is I would connect up several communities to create the images I wanted. So for example, when I lived in Kansas, I was a member of the Lawrence Preservation Alliance, which was a group that had to do with architecture. But I was also a member of the Lawrence Photography Group. And I convinced the Lawrence Preservation Alliance, why don't we have a contest and you pay for the prizes, and the contest will be documenting buildings in the county that we lived in. And those photographs will come into my archive. So I put this triangulation together of the 2 groups and me, and I ended up with more photos of documenting the buildings in that county. So this particular one that you see, the Baltic Community Photograph Project, came about because I happened to go to Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and I went to a small Latvian photography museum, and I came back and started thinking about that. And we have almost nothing on the Baltic community in here in Seattle, and there are definite active Estonian, Lithuanian, and Latvian communities. And so I got together with the Slavic studies librarian who was connected with the Baltic studies, the person who was head of Baltic studies. And those people introduced me to the heads of the communities. And they decided who we should go to document. And I put that together with the fact that we have the Mary Randlett collection, and Mary Randlett, I hired Mary Randlett to photograph these people. So we got to go to their homes and we photographed them. And then I also took some of their photographs of their earlier lives, which we copied. And so we did this wonderful project where we documented important people in these communities. And also we made framed photographs, which eventually I took to Latvia, and they toured through Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So they were exhibited there. And the person who is the Slavic studies librarian uses these photos, like the president, I think, of Lithuania came to visit. And so he pulls out the Lithuanian photo. So this was a real useful project. And I never would have gotten documentation of the people in these communities without going out and thinking about this project. So it benefited, it was a benefit to a number of different people in the community. So that's what proactive collecting is, that you go out and you figure a way to actually do a collection. Oh, and I should point out that the Wisconsin Sesquicentennial Rephotography Project was exactly that. I created that project to collect across the state, and it was a very, very large and fortunately funded project, and which resulted in the book that I did. So the first thing to know is that a collecting policy is really important. It's important to define your institutional collecting scope as clearly as possible. You need to know, well, what are we collecting and why are we collecting it? And that way, when the person walks in the door with something in their hand that has nothing to do with what you do, you can say, no, I'm sorry, that's not in our collecting scope. So a collecting scope is really, really important. And so when you're dealing with donors, you need to know, what do they want? What does a donor actually want? Donors come to you with different things in the back of their mind. You need actually patience to figure this out. For example, sometimes people just want to clear out their garage. I took in a collection from an architectural photographer who lived down the street from me. He's a very, very good photographer, but he wanted to clear out his garage. And so you are offering something to the donor that they want, but sometimes they want a collection named after them, or they want a tax write-off, or they just want to be told that this stuff is important and they want you to listen. So, they also don't always give you everything they have. They may not realize that they have other things you want. So in going there and taking some, I had to sort of eke out the photographer down the street. And I said, no, I want everything, not just this, I want everything. So when you're dealing with donors, you need to really listen sort of to what they're not saying, what's in the back of their mind. And you want to also respect what it is that a donor wants. Sometimes they don't even know what they want, and you have to find it for them. And one example of this is that when I was in Kansas, I was contacted by the Leavenworth, Kansas Public Library, and they wanted me to come and look at a collection of glass plate negatives they had. So I went there and I looked at their negatives, and I knew, but I did not say this to them, I knew that they should not have those glass plate negatives. They had no way to deal with those glass plate negatives. They were of no use to the library. And so what I did was I said, okay, here's how you have to take care of them. You need to get archival supplies. You need to do this and this and this and this and this. So I inundated them with all the things they needed to do to take care of those glass plates. And then when I was done with all that, I said, well, there could be another option. You could donate them to us. I was at the University of Kansas, and we could give you prints, which they did. And we ended up giving them prints, and they ended up doing a little book on the collection. And it worked out to be of mutual to both of us. So we had a wonderful little collection, and they had access to their collection. And we did the exact same thing with the Nordic Heritage Museum, who had films of obsolete films they couldn't look at. And so we had them donate them to us. And then we got a grant to reformat them. And so then they got discs that they could use to actually see the films that they could never see. So if you do that kind of thing, though, you have to do it. You don't just walk in and say, oh, I want those. I knew immediately when I saw the glass plates in Leavenworth that the best solution would be for them to come with us. But that's not what I led with. I let them know what the reality of taking care of it was, so they could make that decision on their own. So you have to respect definitely what the donor wants, and you tell them what your repository can do for them, and what it can't and what it cannot do for them. That we're not going to just have you deposit this stuff and in 20 years you'll decide to sign a donor form. That's not going to happen. So you also should advise them that the archive may not necessarily take everything. Sometimes we return portions of a collection to the donor because it doesn't fit. It might be like, most of the time, it would be family photos that the person is maybe a journalist, but there were some family photos in there. So we return that to them. But you also want to discourage them from putting any kind of excessive restrictions on the collection. If someone says, well, I'm going to give you this collection, but I only want this group of people to see it, that's not going to be useful in the long run. You really want to discourage that. The activity of appraisal consists of considering how photographs and moving images you've been offered will fit into your collection. Appraisal requires the knowledge of the range and scope of your collection, and it also means taking into account your institutional resources and the needs of the patrons you serve. So if you are offered a collection, you have three options. You can say no, you can say yes, and you can say yes, but we'll only take part of it. You can take all of it, some of it, or none of it. The most important starting point is the collecting policy. It's important to define your institutional collecting area as clearly as possible. If you don't know the limits of your collections, you can't adequately decide whether or not materials belong in it. It becomes hard for you to be able to focus on what is truly important to collect, and your collection runs the risk of being swamped with materials that are irrelevant to your mission. A written policy helps to force you to clarify your scope by putting it on paper. And one of the things it can help with is when someone walks in the door with yet another butter churner and you have 5 of them, you can say, no, we have them already and we're not going to accept this. You can always say no. Okay. So when appraising photographs, you need to evaluate the materials based on institutional accountability, technical and informational standards. So first, institutional accountability. Is it being offered with no strings attached? For example, can you weed the part of it that may be unwanted? Many years ago, many years ago, I worked for the Smithsonian Library, and they had several large collections of books that were basically stuck in a corner unused because the collections had been given to them with the proviso that they couldn't be weeded, and they contained lots of duplications of books that had already been given to the Smithsonian. So these collections were basically white elephants. They basically ate, they ate because they gave less to the institution than they took away from the institution. Does the material come without legal problems? First, does it really belong to the donor? You can get tangled up in family problems if this is not clearly stated by the donor. And in the case of small places, I would say this is really, really, really an important thing. You need to make sure that the person who's donating it does have the right to donate it. So are there unacceptable restrictions? For example, no one can ever look at it, so why would you take it? Is the donor weird or hard to work with and thus will require enormous amounts of staff time and resources? I had a very lovely lady, older lady, who gave me a collection of glass plate negatives her father had made, but she kept calling me over and over and over again, and she sort of never went away. And so that collection began to eat because she never went away. So do you have somebody who's very hard to deal with? Do you want to take that on? Is that something you want to take on in your institution? Are you ready to do that if this person is hard to work with? Are there copyright issues? If there are, can they be settled? For example, can you get a sunset date after which you gain copyright? And by the way, I would always ask for a sunset date. If you don't know what a sunset date, that means the day that the agreement changes. So I have photographers who are currently active photographers, and if they donate to me and keep their copyright, that's fine. But then in the deed of gift, we write down the copyright will come to us after either my death or XYZ date, at some particular date. And that's a very important thing to do because you will spend your time having to find heirs and heirs of heirs to be able to get permission, for people to use the materials. Is the provenance or ownership established? As I said, does the person actually own the materials? Are there any sensitive issues relating to the materials? Are there issues with privacy, NAGPRA, which is the Indian Graves Act, sexually explicit materials, potentially embarrassing materials, racist or other issues? How does your collecting policy deal with these issues? So, for example, when I worked at the University of Kansas, we had a very large collection, a very important collection called the Laird Wilcox Collection. And this was from a man who collected both left-wing and right-wing material. And it had some really nasty stuff in it. I mean, horrible, nasty, bigoted, racist stuff. However, the point of this collection was to collect and document this material. And in fact, the collection was used a lot by, for example, the Southern Poverty Law group would come and look. You could look and see who these groups were. So there was a reason for that, but there wouldn't necessarily be a reason for your institution to take material like this. And that obviously was in our collecting policy. It was a part of what we collected, and it had a purpose. We didn't collect it for no apparent reason. At the Kinsey Institute, they study human sexuality. So they have a reason for collecting material that relates to sexual issues. So, but, you know, is your institution, is this something that your institution is going to collect? Does the material actually belong to other archives or institutions? Are there photographs which are copies issued by other institutions? Check for stamps on the backs of the photos. Return the material to that archive that issued it, or you can keep it in your collection, but make it restricted. So if a patron wants a copy, they are directed to the original institution. This is one of the reasons we stamp the backs of patron, or used to, photo reproductions with our credit line and statement that they have no right to reproduce these. And this is a really, really important thing, because I can't tell you how many collections I've been to who have copies of stuff from other archives. And unless you put it in a reference file, it should not be there. If it's in a reference file and it says clearly, we will not reproduce these, it just takes up space. You are not there to be the archive for Mohi, for example. I find a lot of Mohi stuff in our collection, which I take out. We're not here to be the archive for Mohi, so I'm not going to keep stuff from Mohi in my collection. I mean, it might be wonderful stuff. We do have an archive called the Yukon Archive, way up in the Yukon, and they have a lot of copies of our material. And because they're a small archive and they don't have a lot of access to stuff, they're great. Whenever somebody wants to order a copy, they send them to us, and it works out beautifully. But they are very clear that that stuff doesn't belong to them, and that's something that you really should do, just for ethical purposes. Does the material overlap with any other nearby institutional holding? For example, Manitowoc, Wisconsin was an important shipbuilding town, and both the Manitowoc Public Library and the Maritime Museum have photo collections. So you're overlapping. So as the public library, you would just want to keep a selection of sampling of shipping images, whereas the Maritime Museum would be the logical place for a large collection of shipping imagery. Does the material really fit into your collection? A regional archive would be interested in material that covered the region and was very broad-based, while a small historical society would be more interested in specific local people and places. Although a large regional collection might encompass the local historical society's area, there still are collections that would be more appropriate for both of them. For example, while a collection of 10,000 glass negatives of the town might be of interest to the local historical society, it would be in the collecting scope of the regional archive and would not be a drain on their resources. Such a collection, however tempting, would not be the best choice for a local historical society to accept. The resources necessary to care for it are unlikely to ever be in the historical society's budget. They would be far better off to send it to the larger archive and perhaps volunteer to spend some time in the processing. On the other hand, a collection of unidentified portraits with a photographer's stamp indicating that the photographer was from the local town would be better suited in the local historical society, where they might be identified someday. So lastly, excuse me, I just got to see if oh, no, go back. Sorry. Lastly, never accept a gift that eats. Can your institution afford to care for this material properly? Don't accept collections that are beyond your resources. Can your institution really handle it? Do you have the resources to care for that collection of 30,000 glass plate negatives, or 12,000 16 millimeter films, or 5,000 3/4 inch videos? Will it be too expensive to process or provide access for? Do materials in the collection need special care and handling? For example, moving image materials. You need a person you need equipment, and you need a person who knows how to run that equipment. Can your institution handle all the formats in a large collection? A studio photo collection may have glass plate negatives, nitrate, and other flexible negatives, as well as different print formats. Is there a lot of oversized material? Do you have storage for it? Do you have a way to make a guide to the collection available to researchers, or to digitize parts or all of it? Even if it is good stuff, are you really doing the researcher a favor by taking a collection you can't adequately support? One last factor of never accept a gift that eats: does it have general nuisance value? Is having the collection going to be a major pain for you for whatever reason? And I can tell you, a lot of times the inclination is we should take this because it's our town and it's here. And I'll give you a little anecdote. Many years ago, the Tacoma branch of UW took in a huge collection of architectural drawings from an architect in Tacoma, because the people wanted to keep it in Tacoma. Unfortunately, they have no resources to take care of it. And actually, I'm sorry, it went to the urban design department at UW Tacoma. And it ended up in a closet, and a janitor was the person who let people in once in a while when they wanted to see it. This stuff was not there for research. It was sitting in a closet. So many years went by, and I take care of a collection of almost 500,000 architectural drawings. That's one of our big collecting areas. And eventually I was contacted by the UW UW Tacoma library, and asked if we could take the collection, because the urban studies people said, we don't want this. And so eventually, the moral of the story is that it came to us. We made a finding aid, and it's available to people in Tacoma because they can look online. So you have to be very careful in saying, oh, this is fabulous, and we don't want it to leave the community. Well, can it leave the community but still be available to the community? And that's what I did for the Leavenworth Public Library, and that's what we did for the architecture collection. So you have to be very careful, because sometimes you just like, oh, we just don't want this to leave our community, but then it ends up in a closet and nobody can use it.
Hey, Nicolette, can I just jump in really quickly?
Sure.
On that last point about sort of don't accept a collection that eats. I've visited many of your organizations, folks on the call, and I know that storage for your collections is at a premium. And so I know that Nicolette is sort of talking a lot about two-dimensional collections, photographs, and moving images and things. But the point about the butter churn that she made earlier holds true. All of these things that she's saying really hold true for 3D collections, and the vintage dishwashers that you all have, or the baby grand piano somebody wants to donate. I mean, all of these kind of questions have to be asked, because those type of objects really do eat up a lot of resources. Just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, I mean, that's very important, because yes, I'm talking about photos and film here, but this really is appropriate for everything. So just a little cautionary advice. In general, you should avoid accepting any conditional gifts. These are gifts that eat precious time, money, and space. Deposits, that used to be that people would deposit materials, meaning that they would dump it on you, but they wouldn't give it to you. And we do not accept any deposits, and you should never take anything in your door that you haven't got a donor form for, and that it hasn't been transferred to be your property. And restrictions, as I mentioned, nothing that's a permanent loan. The only reason for a permanent loan would be to negotiate that at some sunset date it comes to you, that it becomes your property. And so those are just kind of a little cautionary advice. Now, there's also ethical considerations. Can adequate care be given to the photographs? Can you ensure security and protection? And this, of course, is anything, butter churns or whatever. Does your institution have the institutional will to accept difficult materials and make institutional decisions, not personal ones. You need to take your own feelings out of a decision. You may need to accept something that you don't like, that you don't agree with. I mean, the Laird Wilcox collection has a lot of stuff in it that is really nasty, but it's an important collection, and it's an institutional one. And ironically, when I was at Kansas, there was some archive that had a lot of material they didn't like, so they burned it. You know, that's ridiculous. They should have just sent it to another archive. If you don't agree with it and you don't want it in your institution, send it somewhere else. But try to keep your own feelings out of these decisions. So another thing is technical standards. So is it a copy? And I was just saying, is it a copy from Mohi? Don't take it. But is it a copy photo? That means it's not an original. So what you really want to, what is one of the most common problems that I see in photo collections is multiple copies of the same image, which may exist in different sizes and printing styles, but they're all the same image. You are not helping a patron by keeping them. When I was at the University of Kansas archive, we had a very large collection of Lawrence, Kansas images, and it wasn't really processed. So when I processed the collection, I found almost 200 images of the Dutch windmill, which actually was a Swedish windmill, which was the most photographed building in the town. It was a building that was built in 1863 and burned down in 1905. When I examined the photos closely, I found out that there were only about 50 different images, and all of the rest were simply variants or variant printing or copies of the same images. So it did not help our patrons to have a random 200 photos of which they were the same photographs. So is it a duplicate? Now, a duplicate means that the photographer printed 2, 3, 4 copies. So it is an original photograph, but it's just a duplicate. And you see this in publicity photos. I have a collection where I found something like 60 duplicates, which I obviously was not going to keep all of those. I usually keep one duplicate and file it in a duplicate section in case something happens. But so a duplicate, though, is actually an original photo. Is it an obsolete format? Is it a photographic format you can handle? Is it a moving image format you can handle? Do you have the resources to keep it, or will it simply just sit on your shelf? For example, if we're talking about film, 2-inch quad video is a giant paperweight. It's enormous. I don't know if you can see this, but it's like that. It's huge. That's the original videotape. And literally it's a giant paperweight because you have to have it converted. And now there's very few places in the United States you can convert it. You know, is it 35 millimeter film? Is it nitrate film? You should be aware of what formats you can handle, and in the future of what you will do with obsolete formats. So for example, if I go back to the Nordic Heritage Museum, they had a bunch of different formats, but for them, it was useful to give it to us because we have the only active film archive in the state, and we could do something that complemented both of us. And having it sitting on a shelf didn't do them any good. So sometimes there may be things that you're better off to find another archive for and make an arrangement. There's no reason why you can't make an arrangement with another archive. Is the material deteriorating? Is it full of bad nitrate? For example, is it moldy? Is it faded? Is it brittle? Is the film unable to be viewed? Can you handle the specific preservation needs of this material? And is the material technically bad? Is it just bad? Poorly filmed, poorly printed, blurry, out of focus, too gray, too contrasty? Are the black and whites in the photo all blocked up and lacking information? Is it bad composition, dull, banal, boring? I mean, one of the things that is extremely boring are political photos. And so when I have a large collection of some senator or something, we weed out a lot of the boring, what are called grip and grins. And that's people shaking hands, getting an award, shaking hands, grip and grin. You know, there's a lot of really banal photos, and you have to think to yourself, is this something that's my researchers are going to want to see? Now, if you're a small historical society and it's the only photo of the mayor of the community in 1863, obviously, even if it's bad, it's important. So you put together the informational standards and the technical standards. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Oh, no. So sorry, I was supposed to go ahead. Okay, seem to be out.
And Nicolette, just quickly, we've got some questions in the chat. Do you want to save those for the end? We've already kind of moved on a little bit. So maybe before that, between
why don't you quickly give me the question, see if I can answer them.
Okay, great. Well, they're sort of scenario type questions. So Anne number 1 asks, what do you think of an exception? This was in reference to accepting long-term loans. What do you think of an exception of a large piece of equipment that's operational? The benefit of it being a long-term loan is that we're not maintaining and insuring it. In this case, wouldn't it be better to have it as a long-term loan? Yes, thumbs up. Awesome.
Yes, yeah, that's a specific case. It's not like a collection. That's a specific case. And in fact, we have that in ours, where we have a piece of film viewing equipment that actually belongs to Western Washington, but they couldn't keep it anymore, you know, physically, but we could use it. So we have that. Yes, that is a kind of exception that's valuable to both parties.
Awesome. And one more quick scenario for you from Anne number 2. We have been guilty of accepting things when we know the larger historical society can't properly care for them. Should we just start a dialogue? I feel like we are stealing someone else's history. So a bit more about how organizations can talk to each other about these kind of collections decisions, maybe.
Yes, I think you should always talk to other institutions. And it may be that there's a different institution. Sorry about this. It may be that there's a different institution. You refer to the larger historical society, but perhaps there is another museum or archive that you might deal with. So one of the things would be to cast a wider net, or like you may be in Ellensburg and I'm here in Seattle, but we have institutions here that maybe actually could help you. So I think having dialogues, having relationships with other historical societies. I mean, you may have a historical society where they're not helpful. You may have another institution where they don't want to help you. They don't want to be bothered. But most of us want to help each other. And if there are ways to do it, we look for those ways. So
yeah, and I'll just add that at the Washington State Historical Society, our head of collections, Maggie Weatherby, is always happy to talk with anybody about a collection that you have, or that you are struggling to take care of, or that you've been offered. So just let me know. You can always reach her through me, or I'm happy to share her email address for sure.
Or even for advice on, should we take this?
Definitely. Yep.
Okay, here is informational standards, and this is kind of the hardest choice, but it's very important. So first, does this collection duplicate material you already have, or does it complement it or fill a hole in the scope of the collection? How much material do you need? For example, if you are the State Historical Repository, do you need to keep every photo of the governor, or should you make a selection from various time periods? This leads back to the question of a coherent collecting policy. You not only need to know what areas you will collect, but you need to know the level of collecting you will do. There is exhaustive collecting. That means every single thing available on the topic. You are the museum of paper clips, and therefore you collect every single kind of paper clip that ever existed. Then there is comprehensive. So that's all materials that meet selection criteria. So for example, we collect the Klondike Gold Rush. So we aren't exhaustive, but we have comprehensive collecting diaries, letters, photos, newspaper articles and stuff. So we're heavy on the Klondike Gold Rush. But on the other hand, there's other topics that we would have representative. Representative is a balanced collection covering basic and significant materials on all phases of the subject. So it's representative. We don't have to have lots and lots of stuff, but we want to be able to represent. For example, one of the things I try to do is get more Eastern Washington in our collection so that we're more representative of the whole state. But in no way am I trying to be comprehensive or exhaustive on that. Selective is only important, basic, or significant items. So, for example, we might collect some non-Pacific Northwest images that have a relationship to activities in the state. For example, there might be some reason for us to collect something on logging in Wisconsin because of our heavy, we have very comprehensive collections on logging. There may be a reason why some collection might be appropriate to have. Now, that would be very, very rare, and there would have to be a very specific reason. And maybe it's a company that's in Wisconsin, but they branched out to the Northwest at some time or whatever. But so we would be very selective about that. Minimal is very selective material that has some relationship to your broader scope. Okay, we'll take one butter churn ladle, but our scope isn't butter churns, but we'll have a ladle so you know what the ladle looks like. And then obviously nothing is collected on this topic. Is there a lack of identification or information about the images? Is it worth keeping lots of unidentified studio portraits? An unidentified farm scene can be useful to our collection, but an unidentified portrait has very little value to our collection. I do not need them for clothing styles because I have a huge collection of images. However, I often send unidentified studio portraits to small local historical societies because they can sometimes be identified locally, or they may be useful because of the photographer's stamp. So there could be, so it's a difference in the scope of the institution. The smaller one may find those of value, but they are not of value to us because we have such large collections, and nobody's going to walk in our door and say, I'd like to see all your unidentified photographs. It's not going to happen. Is there a special importance to your institution? The first views of your town, the founder of your company, first building, whatever. Is there something really special for your institution that you definitely, that's information that you definitely want to collect? Is there some monetary value? Is it by a famous photographer or filmmaker? Is their work held in a collection elsewhere? Is it a rare subject? Do you really want to deal with the problems of monetary value? Can you really protect it from theft or deterioration? That, for example, yes, the Edward Curtis Native American photos, have monetary value. They're huge. The portfolios are enormous. Can you really protect them? I know for a fact that even in our larger institutions, they were not always protected, and they ended up being stolen from certain institutions. So you need to know. Unfortunately, sorry, that's my cell phone now going off. Can you protect it? Can you protect something if it is rare and has monetary value? Is it really ethically a good idea to take something in that you cannot protect? Does the material have evidential or legal value? Does it provide evidence of some aspect of philosophy, activity, methods of a donor or organization? Does it have any legal importance? The material may be deadly dull, but there may be some legal reason. Obviously, we have to collect all of our records of the university. That's a legal issue. We are required for the state archives to collect all the records of our institution. And so maybe there's something that may have some legal value that you want to have. What research or informational value does it have? Is the information unique? Obviously, photographs of Mount St. Helens exploding, or the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination, or the famous photograph of the Hindenburg disaster, those are unique and important information. How does it complement the information in your collection? Is there an aesthetic value to the material? Is it a stunning film or photograph? Aesthetic images have an inherently higher value and make stronger statements than the dull, banal, and boring. So for a researcher, photographs that are aesthetic, also that feeds in the value to them. If its value, however, is mainly aesthetic, does it really belong in your collection? For example, you have a local photographer who does abstract photos of peeling paint. Is that really something you want to accept? Now, maybe that local photographer becomes famous, and so you want to show what the local photographer did. But on the other hand, if this local photographer walks in the door of pictures of peeling paint or rose bushes, is this something that you really think will be of value to your institution? And lastly, will it feed your institution? What are the benefits of acquiring and keeping a collection? Is this a dream donor? A dream donor is a fabulous collection. They'll sign over all the rights, is a personally pleasant person, and is pleased that you are interested in taking it. Should we all have donors like that? It would be great. Can you get support for the collection from the donor or from others who might wish to see it placed in your archive? By the way, now when I deal with donors, I always tell them that if they could, we would love to have money to help support it. It's not, and I tell them, no, we will never turn it down if you don't give us money. No, we will take it without money. But I tell them that having money to go with the collection means that we can work on processing it sooner. You go to the top of the list because we have money and I can hire a student. So I'm always upfront with, and people may never have thought of that, and they end up giving us, little bits of money, which is great. Can you use this collection to increase your visibility in the research or broader community? Could accepting a collection that is not very exciting lead to other more interesting collections being placed in your archive? Is this a collection with marketability, meaning that you could sell images of it? That's not necessarily appropriate for a collection where you don't market your images. Is this a collection that is truly important for your research audience, or exhibits, if you also are a museum, research and exhibit audience? Can you generate goodwill by not accepting it and not keeping it? Or better yet, come out ahead by not accepting or keeping it. You want a collection that is a living part of your institution and not a drain on your resources.
Nicolette, can I interrupt you with some questions?
Sure, absolutely.
So we've got an active chat conversation about butter churns, I think, which are a stand-in for just collection items in general. So a couple of questions. Scenario, I have 3 butter churns with no provenance, but they have been with the museum for a while. I am offered a butter churn with provenance. Is it better to take the new butter churn and de-accession one of the old ones?
Well, my feeling would be yes. My feeling would be get rid of 2 of the 3 butter churns you already have and offer them to some other institution that doesn't have butter churns, and take the one with provenance and keep 1 extra, and never, don't accept anything else unless it's a gold-plated butter churn.
Great. And Erin from Lacey agrees with you. Perfect. Another butter churn question that I think, Holly, I'm going to attempt to put this one way and see if it speaks to sort of your question about what if one of the butter churns without provenance works, right? And could be maybe used with hands-on activities with kids. And I don't know what kind of the collection ethics are around transferring something to, like, at Fort Nisqually, we would have called it like a living history collection. Is there value in keeping one that
Absolutely
works even if we don't know?
Absolutely, because that's a different thing. when you can use it in some particular manner, then it is still feeding your institution. You take the one with provenance, but the other one actually works, and you can use it in things that may give that may bring attention to your institution. Hey, we're going to have how to use old tools day or whatever. And I actually have materials in my collection that I keep for talks. I don't put them in, I don't catalog them. I keep them for talks. I keep them to show people what this is. So I definitely think that that's the kind of thing that you would want to keep.
Does that get to your question, Holly? Okay, great. And then a couple more. This is a question related to that idea of like handling difficult donors. And what if their collections are really awesome and a great fit for the institution? Like, that's kind of a tough question because I'm sure it's a case-by-case basis, but at what point does a donor just become so insufferable that their collection is no longer valuable to the institution?
I think, and that's a very difficult question. That's a very difficult question. And you have to look at, is it worth your time to spend with this difficult donor? Is this a person who wants this and wants that and wants that and wants that, give me this for free and that for free, blah, blah, blah. And you need to sit down and say, this person is taking time from us, is taking money from us. Is this collection so important that we want to put up with this? And it becomes the put up with value. Is it drain? And that's where I say, don't accept a collection that eats. This is a kind of collection that eats, and you have to decide how much of your resources this person is going to eat. That, like, for example, if you accept this collection, will they still be hanging around? Will they still be wanting things? Will they still
even after all the paperwork is signed?
Yes, exactly. So it is a tough question, and you have to really, for each institution has to figure that out. Do you really want to put up with some arrogant person who you have to deal with all the time and never goes away, no matter how good their stuff is? One of the things is to step back and remember how I said, don't make personal decisions, make institutional ones. And the institutional decision here would be, this is a great collection, but I believe it's going to eat our institution. That's an institutional decision. Oh man, I want this collection. I really want this collection, but it's going to eat. And I once sent away, when I was at Wisconsin, I uncovered this fabulous collection that I wanted so bad, but I sent it to another archive because it was photographs of Chinese people in LA. I could not rationalize, no matter how wonderful the photos were, there's no rationalization for keeping that. So you really have to sit down and say, is this going to affect our institution? How much will it affect it? If you know the person is leaving, they're annoying to deal with, but they're leaving the state, you'd probably be better off. But yes, that it's a very, very difficult thing to figure out.
Yeah, kind of a case-by-case thing. Great. So there's Elizabeth has a kind of a technical question. Any advice on separating institutional material from other collections? I keep finding copies of our old posters, programs, flyers, news clippings, accessioned alongside non-institutional artifacts. That's sort of a nitty-gritty question. Any quick thoughts?
Well, that's very easy. That's very easy. You need to set up your own institutional records, and that needs to be a collection. Don't just dump them in with everything else. That should be a collection. The collection is the East Island Historical Society records. That's your stuff. And therefore, everything that relates to your institution goes into that collection, which you keep separate from the other materials, which are collections which have been donated from other people. I mean, we have exactly the same thing. We have the university archives. So those are all the records that relate to the university or special collections or whatever. And those are in their own area. And then the other records are in another one. That's an easy one.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess the labor is going through, since they've been all accessioned all together for so long, you got to kind of extract them out. And I'll just say that there's a lot of commiserating in the chat about the factor of sort of small town politics coming into play with donors. And there's lots
Yes.
of kind of hand-wringing about that. And folks have said that's where kind of having that collecting scope can really come in handy. It can't solve all your problems with the mayor or whatever, but having it, written down and something that you can point to can sometimes get you out of hot water.
Yeah, I very strongly suggest that you get a collecting policy, because you can do this. I use, for difficult people, I say the state will not allow us. And I use an amorphous entity for which they can't contact and they can't fight against. And I just say, I'm sorry, the state doesn't allow this. So if you have your collecting policy, you can say, I'm sorry, our collecting policy designates that we have no more than 2 butter churns, or in this case, no more than 2 of the same artifact, whatever. And you can just say, sorry, collecting policy, which is not you, it gets you personally out of it. But I absolutely sympathize. I know about small town politics, and I know that it's a very difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah. Do you have any other tips for kind of conversations or language to use in those conversations? Because you want that prospective donor to come back to you if there are future collections that they want to give. You don't want to totally turn them off.
Right.
Do you have any tips for
Well,
that?
I would say, your butter churn is a really great thing, but our collecting policy doesn't allow us to take it. However, have you thought of donating your butter churn to the Butter Churn Museum or wherever? Have you thought that I know that there are other places where they would be very thrilled to have this? And if you acknowledge that their stuff is good or whatever, even if it's dreadful, and you're very polite and you say, another archive could use this, or another institution or whatever could use this. And, maybe I can help you find another institution or something. So you keep it pleasant. You ignore what they don't want is to be told this is crap. They have a butter churn that's falling apart and it is crap, but they don't want to hear that. So you just acknowledge their thing, but you say, I'm sorry, the collecting scope will not allow us to take it, but I think you need to investigate, and maybe I can help you investigate, or whatever, something like that, that keeps it on a very pleasant level. But you absolutely, one thing you need to know, and this is really, really important, and many people can't do this, you need to know how to say the word no. And it's not no, but it is no without anything. Because there are people who will come in and browbeat you. And if I say no, well, they'll go, but what about? And I don't take any but. I just say, I'm sorry, it's no. And that's why I can say the state won't allow, or whatever. But you need to learn to say no, and don't get caught up in a person's, but what about this? But what about that? But what about that? Just say, no, I'm sorry, and be very pleasant.
That's great. And definitely both the Anns had some great suggestions that line up with your tip there as well. So one last kind of going back to the idea of institutional collections, kind of technical question from Aaron, and then we can move on. What about when someone donates a collection that contains items that should be part of your institutional collection? It's sort of a mixed collection. Do you move it from one collection to another? Do you remove just those items and put them in the institutional collection?
Well, are you saying that they're going to donate something that has some stuff you want, but not all?
Well, I think it's that maybe they're donating just a big personal collection of a former mayor or something, and some of that relates directly to the history of your institution or the museum, but not everything. How do you kind of tease that out?
First place, we keep our stuff in collections, so it wouldn't matter. We don't tear collections apart and stick them in files. So if this was Mayor Jones, you would have the Mayor Jones collection, and it would be processed, and so people could use the materials that were totally relevant, but you would also know there were other materials that weren't that relevant. Now, here is where you have to decide. You say to the donors, can we return material that is not appropriate to our institution? Maybe there's an album of his trip to Boston and it's a personal album and totally irrelevant. So you talk to the donors and you say, can we write into the donor form? We write it in the donor form, return unwanted material. And then you return that material. But you don't take the collection and tear it apart. You keep it as a collection. So
Right,
that
and
way,
you would just kind of note somewhere in the accession file that these particular items relate to the history of the institutional. I'm not a collections person, so I'm not even sure I'm asking the question correctly, but that would all be notated and cross-referenced so that if you're doing history on, you want to find early board meetings of the first board.
oh, I see. Right. They are, yeah.
You know that some of those items live in this other collection separate from your institution.
Right. And as long as you keep it as the Mayor Jones collection and you describe the collection, then you can go in and it will be listed board minutes, so on and so forth. So you can find them and you can make a notation in your records collection. There are also records of the institution in Mayor Jones collection.
Right. Yeah. That's that all kind of happens in the database management. Piece of it. Gotcha. Okay. Hopefully, Erin, that answered your questions. And I will mute myself and let you continue.
Okay. So one of the things to know about is common types of photograph collections, and understanding these will help you when they're offered to you to know what kinds of things will be in them. So first, newspaper collections. Now, newspaper collections are the best place to find activities of the community at large, as well as news and historical events. The images are usually well composed and in general focus on people and their activities. Newspaper collections are good sources for people researching the local community and are excellent for the general researcher who wants images relating to people, events, and social attitudes during various eras. The one problem, however, is that newspaper collections tend to be very large. But newspaper collections also tend to come to you processed because they're generally in date order, and you don't want to take them out of that date order. Another kind of collection is the family or amateur collection. These usually contain the poorest quality images, unless it happens to be a talented amateur photographer. In general, they also contain the most stereotypical imagery and the same types of imagery: people standing on porches in front of cars, children playing, dogs. A family collection, however, is usually the only place to find good, candid imagery of family life and homes. The small town amateur professional photographer collections are a subset of family and/or commercial type photographers. The work may be well composed, containing a nice quality of candid and image and format, and may be a mixture of family, town scenes, and local portraiture. It is usually a good source for someone researching a particular place or town. These photographers tend to be technically better than the usual family photographer who is just interested in taking pictures of their family. Sometimes these photographers may even sell their work in the local community or may run a little photo studio for a while. Commercial photographer collections contain well-composed imagery of businesses, industry, and various organizations and/or portraiture. The photographer is more concerned with documenting the business, person, or activity for the owner or the client than in human activity, which is the difference between it and the newspaper ones. So the imagery is generally not candid, but rather formal. In particular, they can be good sources of place imagery, such as buildings and local landscapes, and of people working and in organizations. The archival records of businesses often contain commercial photography and can be good sources of place. For example, photographs of a manufacturing company or work activities, photographs of a dairy operation. These can be excellent sources of imagery illustrating various time periods. Organizational records generally contain photographs made by news photographers and commercial photographers. They tend to have limited use for researchers unless the researcher is studying that particular organization. The imagery, while usually well composed and technically good, is generally banal and stereotypical and contains little information. The most common imagery of this is the grip and grin, people shaking hands and getting awards. And organizational records are more, have less variety of information in them. Government agency records can be a rich source of imagery for researchers because they are usually made by commercial photographers, which means good technical quality and composition, and they often document large areas of a particular activity across a state or region. For example, state agencies often have had programs to educate people across the state, so they contain good documentary material of wide-ranging interest. They may contain good imagery of people doing activities such as an extension program, teaching farm methods to people in rural areas, an educational program for migrant workers, an employment office retraining program for workers, and of scenery across the state. Interestingly enough, the Department of Transportation documentation contains great images for showing the landscape across the state. Many archival collections contain photographs from the 1930s, federal WPA, FERA, and other projects during the Depression era. The federal government projects from this period were particularly well documented. And personal or art photography. These collections usually have well-composed imagery, but may be more limited in use because of copyright issues or of the focus on the photographer's interest. A photographer may make beautiful photographs of farm landscapes, but the composition of the images make them useful for generic, nice-looking farm scenes, but less useful for the researcher wanting an image of a specific place. So sometimes the photographer may make both an aesthetically pleasing image and a useful document as well. So these are iffy. You know, like I said before, if the person wants to give you a whole bunch of pictures of peeling paint, yeah, you know, there has to be a good reason for you to accept it. So now what I want to do is I want to, okay, so I'm going to stop the share for a minute. And I'm going to hopefully get to 2 documents. I want to read to you a brief, I can get it. Okay, actually, I don't have to share screen for this. I do, because I can't read it. I want to read to you a brief appraisal that I did when I was at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And just so you can get a feel or a flavor of the thinking in terms of this. So when I worked at the Wisconsin Historical Society, a person came and wanted to sell us a collection of photographs of a little town called Humbird. So I'm going to read you what I wrote up about this. So provenance. We have been offered a collection of approximately 200 real photo postcard images of the town of Humbird and the surrounding vicinity by a dealer in historical photographs who is offering to sell the collection for $2,000. Description. The photographs were made by a local town photographer. The collection consists of photo postcards typical of the early years of the 20th century. The dates of the collection appear to span the teens and the 20s. The subjects are very fine views of the town, surrounding area, the people and their activities. The street scene images are excellent quality documentation. Many of the images are well identified. A set of 3 images of note are of a man and his radio, identified as first home-built radio in Humbird about 1922. The image quality appears to be excellent. The composition and the information content of the photographs is above normal for such collections. The dealer sent a photocopied selection of the photographs, so I cannot comment on the technical quality of the printing, but I would guess that is good. Appraisal. This is an important collection to obtain if possible. It is a detailed view of a small town and surrounding area that makes a fine, coherent portrait of the area and its citizens. We currently have very few images of Humbird, and it is unlikely in the future that we would be offered photographs of this quality and number depicting this town. It is unusual to find a collection of real photo postcards intact because they can be sold individually much easier than finding a buyer for the whole collection. It is also unusual to find such good documentation of small towns because they were less likely to have a good photographer living and working in the area. We usually must depend on family photograph collections, unless the small town is located near a much larger town, to document smaller communities. Family photograph collections, however, usually provide very limited sources of documentation on the surrounding community and often contain poor quality and pedestrian imagery. Photograph collections such as this one of Humbird are valuable for their quality, completeness, and scarcity. This collection has value both for researchers of local or Wisconsin history and for the researcher who is looking for imagery and doesn't care about the wear of the images. I would recommend, however, that we first offer the dealer $1,500 because in his description of the collection, he indicated that portions of the 200 are many photographs of automobiles and many photographs of people in sleighs, many photographs of random people. I think that the quality and scarcity of the imagery still makes it worthwhile paying the asking cost of the collection if he does not want to reduce his price. So as you can see, what I'm saying here are many of the things that I was just discussing. You can see I'm talking about the different kinds of photo collections that I just talked about. I'm talking about technical quality. I'm talking about informational standards. So this is one example. The other example I want to give you is after this, we're going to break out into, most of you, I think, got the exercise. And after this, I want to break out into breakout rooms and talk about the exercise, what you think about it. And so the second thing I'm going to read to you is some of the issues that you would consider when you are doing this exercise. So see if I can find this. So, so here we're being offered a collection, the Jones Brothers logging photographs, which are 1,000 glass plate negatives of logging scenes in Eastside County made by Jones Brothers Photography Studio. The person is offering to donate them. So here are reasons why we would want or accept this collection. It is in our collecting scope. We collect Eastside images. We want to document industry in Eastside County. The size and variety of images in this collection makes it a good document of the logging industry. 3, although we have some logging photos, these do not duplicate our current photo holdings. The negatives were made by a commercial studio, so the quality of documentation and aesthetics are excellent. They will be useful to a wide range of researchers nationally as well as locally. We will be able to market copies of the photos in order to raise money to help support the collection, assuming that your archive has a system for this. They are being donated with no restrictions, and the donor is willing to sign the standard donor form. And the donor will be pleased with the recognition, thank you letter, and does not need any special treatment or long-term negotiation to finalize the donation agreement. Now, here are some potential problems which could affect the decision to take this collection. So before accepting it, our institution will have to answer these questions. Does our institution have the money to pay for the necessary supplies needed to care for it? Does our institution have the space to store 1,000 glass plate negatives? The negatives have no prints. Is it too expensive to get scans made? And how will access to the collection be handled in order to protect the negatives? A few other problems that another collection might have, not necessarily this one, is the donor is not giving up copyright. The donor is asking for complicated or unworkable restrictions. The owner is asking for money or too much money. Parts of the collection are deteriorating. Only one portion of the collection relates to the collecting scope. The collection has a very narrow range of potential use for researchers, and the images are aesthetically very poor, banal, out of focus, and not much use to researchers. So these are some of the things that just to kind of show you that you're thinking about. So the exercise I put together, and Allison, pretty much everybody got the exercise? I don't know if you read it, but what I have is 3 archives, and they're very different. And they're all in the same area, so they overlap. So you have the East Side Historical Society, which is a little tiny volunteer group that has a room that the city government, it's in East Island. East Island is the town. So East Island is the town, and the town has given them a room, and they have about 200 photos. They've got some stuff that isn't appropriate. I think I've said glass plate negatives from another area. It's all volunteer, and mostly the stuff is used for exhibition. And then the second archive is a museum and archive. So this is East County, is that what I called it? East County Museum and Archive. And it's fairly large, and they have both researchers, and they have exhibitions. So, you know, their exhibit curators use their collection a lot because they are a museum. And then the third archive is a very large research archive, which so the museum and archive collects the county, East Side County, and then the Pacific Northwest Archive, whatever it is, collects East Side County and beyond. So those are the 3 institutions that we have, and hopefully you have that description of them to work with. And then I have 8 collections that are either donations or they are offers for purchase. And so what I want to discuss is which archive should these go to? Which archive should accept them, or which archive should ask for the purchase? And so what are the reasons why you would do that? Which one would be appropriate? So
we have 23 people on the call now.
So if we do an automatic breakout room.
Yeah. And everybody, I shared the exercise in the chat again. Hopefully you got it in your email, but.
So should we have 4 breakout rooms?
Well, and now some people are now we're down to 19 people. Yeah.
Okay. Should I automatically do 4 breakout rooms?
That's probably good. Then we'll have at least 2 people. We know who's not afraid of a little group activity.
Yeah. Okay, sign automatically. Let's see what happens.
And about how long, Nicolette? Can we do about 5 minutes? Is that too short? 10 minutes?
Well, at least 10 minutes because there are 8 collections.
There's a lot, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, and then I hit open all rooms, I think. Is that right? Okay. And then I'll come into each room. I want to be able to come into each room.
Yeah, do you see where it says you can join? Open, I'm going to stop. I could tell y'all we're still talking because nobody came back early. Y'all got booted out at the last second. Oh, Nicolette, you're muted.
We actually were on to something really interesting. Jean and Holly, you were, can we just finish that? Because it was real interesting. About the Sheriff's Department crime scene photos.
I was just saying that the content is makes it a difficult collection to handle.
Yes, yes.
But I'd have to say that if some of the cases were in like my particular town or my particular area, it'd be harder to say no to some of those.
Yeah, they are from that little town, East Island town. But one of the things is there's 900 photos, which is negatives and prints.
That's true.
You know,
and a lot of them unidentified.
Yeah. Yeah. But although, you know, they relate to the case.
Right.
Yes.
And I'll throw a kink in that. I used to work at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and the only way that they could find out what kind of what people had on their walls or on the floors of their apartments was by looking at crime scene photos, because the police were the only ones who had the equipment to be able to take photographs inside. So
yes,
an unexpected use.
Yes.
Huh.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. The small historical society could never deal with this because of the subject and because of the large collection. And this is something that should go to either of the larger ones. And by the way, I can tell you that every single one of these is based on something. It's changed a bit, but it's based on a collection I was offered or had. And this is a collection, in fact, that I got from the Dane County Sheriff's Department. And there is problematic stuff in it. But as a larger archive, you know, and if you make a good finding aid, people can avoid, they don't have to look at the suicides, you know. If you would have a finding aid that would list the crime, you know, so that way people could avoid looking at that. But yes, and people don't think about that kind of documentation. Obviously, the sheriff was going to throw it out, and they would, but they're actually, as you're saying about the tenement museum, there is good documentation in that.
I think too, the smaller museums, you tend to have a possibility of having more volunteers that would find the information offensive and then just
Yes.
toss it without.
Yes, yes, yes. And that is knowing your museum. That's about knowing your museum and what you, I mean, knowing your organization. Like we wouldn't do that. You wouldn't be a place where you'd want to deal with those issues. Even if it was a smaller collection that you could absorb, it's probably not the right place because you don't want to deal with those issues. So there is one, I don't know if you guys got all the way to the end, but the very last one, I just like to mention this. The last one is, no, not that one. Collection 7. 42 large, ranging from 3 to 4 feet high photographs mounted on masonite panels, which are portraits of famous prominent people in the East Island community, astronaut, rich businessman, mayor, senator, blah, blah. The photographer is living and keeps all the rights to the photos. You cannot issue copies of or allow them to be used without written permission of the photographer. The photographer is quite vain about her work, but the imagery is quite pedestrian and uninspired. The people depicted in the portraits assume that the collection is going to be on display. The collection was originally purchased by the East Island town government, which now wants to get it out of their way and are willing to donate it to your institution. So what about that one? Can you think of a place for it to go? No?
I'm from a small museum and we have certain things that are similar to this and they just take up space in our storage room. They never get looked at. They are very awkward to try and display at any point. And I think that we should deaccession what we have. So if it were me, I would say, no, we can't take them. We might take photos of them if we thought that that was something to keep, but not the actual 3x4 boards. We wouldn't be able to.
Yeah. This collection is actually based on a collection that was foisted on us when I was at the University of Kansas. And the photographer got, God knows why, the university to buy these photos from her. And then they eventually dumped them on us. And you're absolutely right. Big 4 foot photos on masonite. There's no way to store them. Nobody could use them. And they weren't useful for research because they were famous people. Anybody can get photos of these famous people. And had it not been dumped on us by the university administration, I would have just gotten rid of them, just thrown them away. And ironically, the photographer was not very good, even though she thought she was very good and made these ghastly huge things. But yeah, this is an example, you know, of a collection that eats. You just, you know, we found a place to stick them in a corner and, you know, never seen again. And so there's things like that, you know, that are just not going to bring anything to your institution.
So would you say that's the same situation for collection 8? That since those photographs are already found in other local regional archives, that you would decline those as well?
Yes, in fact, or I might take them and destroy them. actually for me, more logically, I would take them and destroy them, because there's no reason for that collection to circulate. It's copies of copies of copies. We have like copies of the Seattle fire. There are so many copies of the Seattle fire, that circulate around, and they get worse and worse and worse as they're copied and they're recopied and they're recopied. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There is no value in taking these because they exist across in different archives, and they are bad. I think I said enlargements, right? Which means that they're even worse.
Yeah. So can you just go through the different collections and say real quick what you would think? I would think, like, for example, number 6, it would be tempting, if that's the only known view of the west side of East Island before it sank into the bay. Even
Yes.
even if it's not.
Yes, that's one where you're taking something that has preservation problems, but it's unique. So, you think back and forth, well, are there preservation issues? I don't want to take this because of this, but this is one that I would purchase. The actual amount is not bad. I mean, now I understand that smaller historical societies or smaller institutions don't have money, but in the world of purchasing, I have a really small budget for purchase, but I do purchase photo collections. That's a really reasonable amount of money for that unique photo. So, in essence, it would go to the archive that has the money to purchase it. And either of the two larger archives, it's a good image for either one of them. Let's see. So the other purchase, collection 5, a dealer comes in offering to sell you for $300, 30 random East Island, East Side, and Mountain County photographs. Most of them have minimal or no identification. They are of landscapes, roads, and building. Among them are 7 views of the burning of the Buddhist temple on East Island. No photos have ever been seen of this event. So even though this is one, again, the amount is reasonable, and you have unique images coming with it. It's like I said in the Humbird appraisal. Yes, I knew there were like lots of stuff, automobiles or whatever, but the other stuff was so good as to say, take these. So again, that's a reasonable amount, and you could have them in your files if they are landscapes or buildings. They maybe somebody could identify them. So it is one that I would look at purchasing. What else is there?
For collection number 2 and number 3, we sort of agreed that we'd try to bump those up to the bigger institution.
Yeah, I would tend to agree because of the glass plate negative issue.
Right.
And so, not that they couldn't go to the local, the museum and archive, the mid-range one, but that I would tend to say. The other thing too is in the one that's Walter's studio, where you have Mrs. Walters, who burned the photos of the house of prostitution. The bigger institution would probably be more likely to be able to deal with the fact if she ever found out the negatives were there and the images still existed. I would suspect that the bigger institution would be able to deal with any kind of outcry from her,
Right.
or
Right.
to be able to sort of downplay them until such time as she died. But
yeah. On those two things, would you, if you're bumping them up to the other larger institution, maybe ask them for access in the future to those pictures, like the ability to get prints made if they pertain to your particular area, even though you can't take care of the glass plate yourself?
Now, you're supposing you're the other institution?
The small institution. If I'm the small institution.
Oh, the smallest. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
This is where you really want to create a kind of a partnership.
Right.
And so, for example, since we digitize lots of our collections, if you said it's really important to us, and I've done this, I've been contacted by people and they said, oh, we'd really like to see this image. So we've digitized it and put it up on our digital site. So you don't have to worry about getting copies because it's right there on the digital site. So that's the advantage of working with larger institutions like us who are digitizing or have more resources for it. You can say, hey, you know, there's a lot of people who are interested in the Aleutian Islands. So I could go, oh, okay, I'll look at our collections and be sure to make sure that we've digitized the stuff we have from the Aleutian Islands. So working with a larger institution can really benefit you.
Yeah.
Hey, Nicolette, would you, in
Yes.
that case, would you have a document? Obviously, the UW Special Collections would hold the copyright potentially to those things. So would the smaller organization have something in writing that would allow them to use them in exhibitions and social media and whatever?
Well, what you would do, what we do is you apply for permission to use it, and then we issue a letter of permission.
So you would go through that process
Right,
that anyone
yeah.
would go through to use them.
Right. And for us, that means we're not going to charge you any use fee. We charge, you know, we charge use fees to commercial entities, but first that documents the use of our collection, which is important to be able to say our collection is being used. And it formally gives you, the credit line, and it formally gives you the permission to use it. So we prefer that. We give permission to a lot of like a smaller historical society, and also signage. A lot of city entities come to us for images for signage. So that's a good way to do it. You know, you don't have to worry, but filling out our form is actually very, very useful to us. And it also documents for you who you got it from,
Right.
you know, where it came from.
So of all the collections that were mentioned here of the 8, as a small museum, number 1 would be the one that we would take.
Yeah.
Because even though it's not completely identified, the possibility exists, and they were made from a photographer from basically our town, and so we would want that collection.
And they're in good condition.
Right. So we would do that.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah. So for a small institution, and it's much more useful for a small institution, because if they came to my institution, for example, they wouldn't be useful.
Right.
You know, they're unidentified. And so really for the larger ones, it's not appropriate.
Yeah.
Hey, Nicolette, do you have time for one more question? And I think we have to wrap up.
Yeah. And I do want to tell people about the collecting policy, or maybe you could send a message.
Yeah, I'll include that in the email, because everybody's, Nicolette has a wonderful kind of resource, which has some nice templates for everybody. And I'll share that out in the email, I think.
Okay. Okay.
So Alicia was asking, and I have a feeling this is a common challenge for a lot of our smaller organizations that may have like one paid staff member kind of thing. So she says, as a staff of one, it's important for me to rely on multiple voices to understand the value or lack thereof of items and collections being offered. So she has a collections committee. But what happens when I feel strongly about something and the committee disagrees? Who gets the final say? What happens when committee members don't agree or there's a split? Do you have any advice for kind of navigating some of that?
I think one, that's where a written collecting policy comes in. And I would suggest, you know how I wrote up the appraisal for the Humbird collection? I would suggest that if you feel strongly, you write up the reasons. You do an appraisal that you write up so that you can yourself look at it. Why do I want this? What are the purposes, you know, what are the reasons that I feel strongly about this? And then it comes down to, are you going to let your commit? And I understand the politics of a really small place. It's tough. It's really tough. But the question comes down to, are you the person in control, or is this committee in control? And I think the committee is great, but in the end, are you running the archive? Is that your choice? Now, on the other hand, you might get someone who's the person running the archive who decides to collect all sorts of wackadoo stuff. But the truth is, are you the one running it? Because in the end, I think you should have the final thing, because suppose they want to collect something you don't think should be there. You know, I do, but a written collecting policy, and actually sit down and you can, for example, if they decide they want something that you don't think is appropriate, you have them write up an appraisal. Why is this appropriate? And you can also say, this doesn't fit because of this, this, and this. This is not appropriate. because of these reasons. But I know it's a political morass, and I think you have to get down to who's actually in control of the institution, and who is going to make those final decisions. There has to be at least one person who gets the final decision, you know, who gets that final decision. You know, where's that going to come from?
Yeah, and it's tricky. I'm sure your collections committee is probably made up of board members, which adds a whole nother layer to it. So I don't know. Hopefully that was that was helpful at